Hi everyone. This is a video that's entitled Some Issues Related to Cognitive Psychology as a System in the History of Psychology. I plan to include some topics related to cognitive psychology, such as who was first, the name cognitive, what cognitive psychology is, and a comment historically about what it is not, and finally say something about cognitive revolution. First, just a timeline here, and this shows with some reddish highlighting what I think of as modern psychology. Modern refers to, for example, modern cognitive psychology and many of the topics that you've been reading about in Chapter 15, bringing us up closer to now. Modern, to me, refers to about the last 60 to 70 years in psychology. So since about the time in the maybe late 1950s to into the 1960s, which is when many people kind of, just for convenience, using a rough rule of thumb, say that cognitive got going. There was a cognitive movement, or maybe, as a few people suggested, a cognitive revolution. Maybe it's useful to think first about what cognitive psychology is. I asked you about this as the third main discussion question for Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is on cognitive. So this image just lists some, not all, topics that you might find in a modern cognitive psychology textbook: thinking, decision-making, problem-solving. You can read the others. Embodied cognition has become very popular. It's not simple to understand, but once understood can be connected to important historical ideas and research in psychology that make embodied cognition not look as neat and special and brandy new as it might seem. But anyway, some topics there to give you a sense of what cognitive psychology is for now. Let's go on to the question of who is first. And of course, many of you were wise to be very careful about trying to answer that question directly. Who is first? Probably there's a collection of people. I want to remind you of some and maybe add a couple that you might not have been as aware of from our class so far. Certainly one person that you would remember is Oswald Kolpe, who was the German student of Wundt, who used systematic introspection, tried to use systematic introspection to study problem solving, and with his students, Kolpe ended up deciding that there was a phenomena called imageless thought, because the research subjects couldn't really access in their mind what was happening, couldn't access the mental processes involved in solving like arithmetic problems, for example. So you might remember that Kolpe, he wasn't really intending to do this maybe so much as he was trying to study something cognitive. Another suggestion for an early cognitive psychologist, based on what are topics of modern cognitive psychology now, would certainly have to be William James. We talked about William James and considered several mental states and mental processes and related phenomena that he was interested in. Consciousness, which is to say to be conscious, so as to be able to think, experience emotions, have memory, develop habits, pay attention. Remember, stream of consciousness, which involves paying attention to particular thought or idea or association within a stream of what's going on in consciousness. William James was interested in imagination and perception and reasoning, and remember, he's interested in free will. Many, many mental phenomena, certainly mental related phenomena, and we might say they look very cognitive, those topics, now. We have to put Tolman on a list of potential early cognitive psychologists, if for no other reason than he was interested in things like what he called cognitive maps and expectancies. But also don't forget that Tolman was instrumental in developing operational behaviorism, which essentially says, hey, you can study intervening variables. Those are mental states and processes, don't forget. You could study intervening variables, just, do it carefully. Use the aspects of operational behaviorism. It makes Tolman look certainly like he's accepting of the possibility that scientific approaches could be used to study mental life. There are other suggestions, okay? So, for example, here's a guy we haven't met before, William McDougall, who was very interested in the 1920s he used words for what he was interested in, like cognition, caunation, affection. Affection, for example, is about feeling and the action that's associated with the way that we feel. I think looking back, we could easily classify McDougall's interest in psychology as making him a cognitive behaviorist. He's interested in cognition, in mental activity, and the related behavior. And many of us are interested in that, aren't we? There's other examples of early psychologists who look like they're interested in cognitive stuff, but are not modern in the sense of doing their work mainly in the last, say, 60 years. Remember, from the Gestalt psychologists, we encountered Koehler, the one who did the work on insight learning with chimps and other animals. And as soon as you say insight learning, right, problem solving, that sounds very cognitive, right? There's lots and lots of other examples of people who might look like cognitive psychologists. Several of you suggested Jean Piaget, and Piaget is a great suggestion, one of probably many contributors to a movement in cognitive psychology in the middle 1900s, essentially. We could make a pretty long list, I think, actually, is part of the take-home here about who was first. It's really not a fair question. Sandra Ruth Bem, you may recognize as a fairly modern developmental psychologist. She was very interested in child problem solving, schemas. She did other work, too, in the 1980s. Through to near the end of her career. She died in 2014. Sandra Bem also studied gender studies in psychology. She's a pioneering feminist psychologist. But some of her work was clearly in cognitive, right? This looks a lot like a collaborative effort, the development of cognitive psychology. It seems to have its roots in many places, in many events, in many different people's research projects and interests. Go back to those example challenges from Chapter 14. Make sure you understand those. There's a pretty substantial list, and for any one of those, for the final exam, you should be comfortable with how those examples illustrate that there was room for a cognitive psychology to kind of put down roots and get going, and for there to be at least some movement away from strict behaviorism, not Tolman's operational behaviorism, of course, but from strict SR behaviorism. Okay, I wanted to also touch on the issue of the name cognitive. So this image here, and I'll leave this. You might want to pause the video and look at this for a few minutes and read it. It's titled, and I've inserted Harvard here just for accuracy. It's the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies, and you should read this. Because it basically says that at Harvard, they had the resources in the 1960s, in 1960, in fact, to create a Center for Cognitive Studies, and they needed to name it something. And it ended up, of course, being called the Center for Cognitive Studies. But it's interesting, right? Using the word cognition meant the people there at Harvard were setting themselves off from behaviorism. They wanted the name to be about something mental, but mental psychology seemed terribly redundant. Well, actually now, if you think about modern cognitive psychology, the term cognitive psychology is redundant. If psychology is defined in part as the study of mental life, right? Cognitive reads as mental life, the study of mental life. Cognitive psychology does. Anyway, read the rest of that. You could see some interesting suggestions for what the Center of Cognitive Studies might have been called at Harvard. I also wanted to touch on this, and you might want to pause the video at some point to read through at least some of this here. This is about, at Harvard, at the Center for Cognitive Studies, they started to bring in graduate students and, actually train students at Harvard in cognitive psychology. And it says here, for example, the center, quote, was not set up for anything in particular. It was set up to be against things. What was important was what it was not. And maybe you should stop here for a moment and ask yourself, what was it against? What was it not for? Right? Clearly, these people at Harvard wanted the Cognitive Studies Center to be not for behaviorism, right? There were maybe some other things they weren't interested in cognitive psychology to be about. But okay, there's a larger issue here, right? We've encountered repeatedly systems of psychologists in which a lot of the messaging is we are not for that. We are not for what the prevailing system was, or for what other ideas or influences or modes of study or preferences for methods or other factors were that characterized that system, right? Structuralism came along and the functionalists said, we're not just interested in the structure of the mind, we want to know what the mind is for. And then behaviorists like Watson came along and said, the functionalists are just so busy being interested in mental life and mental states, but aren't studying them carefully at all. We need to be more scientific. The behaviorists rejected psychoanalysis. The Gestalt psychologists rejected behaviorism. The Cognitive Studies Center here is, at first, in the 1960s, very much about what it was not for. So isn't that interesting? Much of the sort of major developments in the history of psychology that we focus on, that we sort of organize by these systems, is about what psychology should not be. It's also largely what it should be for as well, but there's a lot of rejecting, right, and trying to move forward in some at least slightly different direction. So this leads me to another issue I wanted to raise about cognitive psychology, which is, was it a revolution? Some of you, in fact, asked this question when you were working on the assignment using the Leahy article from 1992 and trying to generate and then apply criteria from that article in trying to decide whether cognitive psychology really represented a revolution. Some of you asked, did somebody suggest this? And then good for you. So somebody did. So this image here shows from another history of psychology textbook, and there's some citations in here, that yes, indeed, near the green arrow there, some have referred to the change as a, quote, revolution in psychology, and there's a citation from 1972 and 1993. Those are not the only ones, but those are a couple of examples, right? And you can read on there, also including that Leahy, who you read in that article from 1992, argues that cognitive psychology does not represent a revolution. If we had had class, I would have shown a slide like this and worked through it kind of systematically and steered you at first towards Kuhn a little bit, but then away from Kuhn for criteria to use for cognitive psychology. Is it a revolution or not? You'll see in the little blue box there that Cohen and Porter are referenced for their criteria. Those are probably at least as useful as those of Kuhn's. For those of you who focused exclusively on Kuhnian criteria, you should expand a little and go back and look and double check on the criteria from Cohen and Porter, and maybe even reassess a little bit of what you decided about. Is cognitive psychology a revolution? I want to also reiterate, this was not part of that assignment or any other assignment so far, but I want to reiterate in the sort of middle row area of this image here that Leahy himself is highlighted, and even just from reading the abstract, of the 92 Leahy article that he suggests that psychology did not develop through revolutions, but instead through developing research traditions. That's what he calls them, developing research traditions, and he lists some of these in the back of the article. He doesn't discuss them in great detail, but they're worth looking at in the back of that article, and certainly thinking about at least a little bit more. I think on the whole it becomes rather difficult to decide when we use criteria that a cognitive movement that started, say, roughly at Harvard, roughly in the 1960s, really is a revolution. It's not very revolutionary looking. And probably with the aid of hindsight, looking back to that time from now 60 or so years later, it's a little bit easier to see, right? One of our themes is having perspective. It's also useful to have criteria, right? How do you know there's major depression that someone might have? It's very handy to have something to base that on, right? What's a hippopotamus? So criteria are useful, and using many of the fairly well-accepted criteria in psychology, I think it becomes pretty difficult to tell for sure that movement of psychologists that might have begun 100 years or more ago, but that was much more sort of focused and energized around the 1960s and maybe to the present time, meets the definition of a revolution. And maybe that's not bad, right? We just sort of see things for what they are. I just want to mention one thing at the bottom of this figure here, which is a reference to Lorraine Daston, and she's really, really interesting. This is on that same topic of, sort of how do you classify things that happen or change, evolve, or are revolutionary in psychology. And this is totally related to the counter-enlightenment view that we encountered back shortly after meeting the Beer Pledge. Lorraine Daston has said that science often has multiple viewpoints or multiple ways of knowing, and these can be concurrent and overlapping. And I would suggest to you that much of psychology, as we look back at it historically, fits that and or fits Leahy's developing research traditions better than revolution. It's very counter-enlightenment to say, oh, we understand ourselves and things about psychology, the behavior of other animals, consciousness, the unconscious, all these really cool, interesting things by having multiple viewpoints provided by perhaps some of the characteristics of systems that we have been studying, but also maybe perspectives, or viewpoints or schools of thought that are provided, simply by the different fields of psychology that we have, right? Taking a developmental approach, taking a cognitive approach, taking a biological approach, taking sociocultural kind of an approach, and others. These are very useful in combination for understanding the subject matter of psychology. All right, I'm going to end there for now. Thanks for watching. Take care, everyone.